Good morning and welcome to the Bob Unger Show. We are very privileged to have a rare man today. It's kind of like Diogenes when he was walking around with a candle, and they asked him, why do you have a candle? He said, I'm looking for an honest man. Well, in the case of Michael, I think it's Busler, you pronounce it?
Yes, it is. That's correct.
Okay, and in case of Michael Busler, who's a economist and teacher, professor of finance, we have an economics professor who's not a communist. It's kind of like, I should be walking around with a candle, looking for an honest economist.
You found one.
Or one who doesn't have only one hand, so he can say, can't say on the other hand, right?
Exactly.
They usually say on the other hand. So give us a little bit of your background. Is it Dr. Busler?
Yes, it is. My doctorate is in economics. I've been teaching for about 35, 38 years. I've been writing editorial columns way back when we used to write in newspapers back in the late 70s and 80s. Of course, everything's done on websites today. So I write primarily today for Newsmax, Town Hall, the Western Journal, and I write on economics issues and some public policy issues. And when I teach in my classes, I always try to give both sides of the argument on key issues, and I try to encourage students to form their own opinion. The reason you're in college is not just to learn specific things, but to learn critical thinking skills. So here's what one side's saying, here's what the other side's saying. I'll try to keep my views out of it. You decide which one makes the most sense for you. I think that's not done very much in colleges today. My university was started originally as a liberal arts school, and they're still very liberal arts oriented. So the professors, I don't think, are doing a real good job of giving both sides of an argument.
Well, it's interesting you say that because my wife has a PhD in a real subject, science. And when she discusses, for example, evolution, she will give the party line about evolution, but then she also gives the opposite side and tells the students, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to cause you to think.
Exactly. Good for her.
But that is not the case. I went through obviously law school and college, and I was a student at the Bronx High School of Science, which at that time had assembled the smartest Jews in the world in one building in the 1960s. And, everything has really gone downhill. I always say I can beat Michael Jordan one-on-one if you make the basket only 6 inches high. So lower the standards and I'm the greatest NBA player ever.
Good analogy. Very good.
So tell us about your education and how you came to not see everything from a communistic or Marxist or socialistic government / prism.
So I was a hippie back in the 60s and early 70s. So I did favor a lot of these liberal causes. And then when I got out in the real world, I realized everything that I wanted the government to do was coming out of my paycheck. So I decided, if I'm going to earn and take care of myself, I think everybody should do that. I'll tell you the real turning point in my life with regard to my economic philosophies came in 1976. Milton Friedman had just won the Nobel Prize in economics. I wrote him a letter and congratulated him and said, what you're saying, congratulations, but it's not all completely true. I think this is the way it should be. To my surprise, he wrote me back, not very flattering letter, essentially telling me I didn't know what I was talking about. But it started a corresponding relationship. And at the time, I was writing about free market economics in a newspaper called the Philadelphia Bulletin, which at that time was a top 10 daily newspaper. Milton Friedman was writing in Newsweek, and Paul Samuelson was writing, and Milton Friedman would give the conservative view, and Paul Samuelson the liberal view. So I started taking my columns and sending them to Milton Friedman. And to my surprise again, he commented on every one and wrote back to me. And that continued for about 4 years, and it really shaped my thinking in economics and how I became so free market oriented. He really stressed the concepts of freedom, individual responsibility, low rates of taxation, and a limited role for government. And those principles really guided what I did. Incidentally, a little side fact, my daughter went to Stanford for MBA. I went out there to see her one day. Condoleezza Rice was speaking, and I wanted to get to see that. So while she was in class, I had some time to kill. So I went over to the Hoover Institution at Stanford, into their library, and down in their archives, and Milton Friedman had passed away, donated all of his papers to that library. Well, I looked in there and he had saved all of the letters that I wrote to him and had archived them. The archivist came over and saw what I was doing. And I said, I've got the letters that he wrote to me. And she said, well, look, we'd love to have those too. So I donated them to the library. So now almost all the correspondence between the two of us, and you can see how my ideas were shaped over time and some of the things he wrote to me that really kept me going. And I've been trying to apply. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Hopefully you made copies for yourself.
I did with some, but they're all available at the library. So if I need to, I can just go there and get them and make copies of them. So that really guided. And then I started to take a look at some of the problems that the country was having. And I said, listen, it's kind of logical what you should do. And most of this started in the late 70s. Then Ronald Reagan came along and he sort of did what we thought you should do. Everything turned out well. And then over time, things changed. And, lately, really since the turn of the century, I think in the 2000s, things have changed. And now we're in real bad shape. And I keep writing as much as I possibly can to try to show people this is not the principles that made America great. On the big picture, the US went from the birth of a nation to the largest, most prosperous economy in the world in about 150 years. Other countries were hundreds, in some cases, thousands of years older. Well, why was that? I believe that, as Milton Friedman suggested to me, those 4 basic principles. We encouraged individual freedom, as long as you didn't infringe upon anybody else's rights, you can pretty much do what you wanted. We encouraged individual responsibility, as long as you were mentally and physically able to take care of yourself, everybody did. We had very low rates of taxation. So whenever you earned anything, you knew where you're going to keep most of it. And fourthly, we had a limited role for government. They provided certain public goods like defense of the country, a legal system, et cetera. But aside from that, they sort of stayed out of the way. So following those principles of individual freedom, individual responsibility, low rates of taxation, and a limited role for government, that's what made America great. Now you look at the current Biden administration and even the Obama administration before, it's opposite to all 4 of those principles. They want the government to control markets, the healthcare market, the education market. And once the government controls that, you lose individual freedom because the government will decide who does what. Secondly, they try to replace individual freedom and responsibility with social responsibility. Well, the government will take care of this, the government will take care of that for you. That's social responsibility rather than people taking care of themselves. Thirdly, to pay for everything, you're going to have to raise taxes. So you have a very high rate of taxation, and both the Obama administration and the Biden administration want to keep adding taxes on, particularly for the people who are very successful and create opportunities in the economy. And fourthly, instead of a limited role for government, they want an expanded role for government. That's why the economy is in such bad shape today. We're about to enter, I think, a recession, and we may even be in one now, but enter a recession. And worse yet, we're looking at a stagflation problem, stagnant economy with high inflation, also starting, it may be now, but most likely by the end of the year.
Well, it's interesting that you say that we made this tremendous advance in 150 years, which is, of course, absolutely true, except to liberals. But we had no Federal Reserve private bank at that time. And isn't it interesting how deflation was a good thing during that period? Because productivity and innovation and entrepreneurship make products cheaper, not expensive. And somehow the establishment somehow brainwashed the American sheeple into thinking that inflation is a positive thing. Well, it may be positive under the Cantillon effect for people who already own massive amounts of assets. In other words, when my properties go up in value, it's good for me, but it sure isn't good for kids coming up now who have to pay an exorbitant amount of overvalued amounts for properties. And so this is hurting the next generation. But I think that our generation, and I'm 68 years old, I think most of my generation is extremely selfish. They want their goodies and they don't give a damn about their grandkids. They pretend they do. But if you gave a damn about your grandkids, you would not be happy about this.
You're certainly right. The federal government is authorized to be $31.5 trillion in debt. And I say, well, what does that mean? Is that a lot of debt? Well, most economists will tell you if the total debt is less than 1 year's GDP, it's probably tolerable. If it gets above that, you have problems. Well, GDP is only in the $22 trillion range. We're up to 31.5 trillion in debt, way over 1 year's GDP. So what kind of problems will that create? Two. Number one, when the federal government borrows money, they sell 10 or 20-year bonds. There's no program in place to ever pay that money back. So what do? They sell a 10 or 20-year bond. The bond matures. They pay interest on it every year. The bond matures. They don't have money to pay it back. They sell new bonds to pay back the old bonds, and you roll over the debt. Why is that significant? This year, the interest on the public debt will be about $400 billion. As that debt gets rolled over, most of that debt was taken out when interest rates are 1.5%. In the next few years, they're going to return to the normal 2.5%, 3%. So even if you take on no more debt, just rolling it over at a higher interest rate, instead of 400 billion, you're up to 800 billion. And we're adding more debt each year. Now you're looking at $1 trillion a year in interest expenses on the public debt. You talk about placing a burden on future generations. That's a huge burden that is being placed on them. And I'm worried about my kids and my grandkids, as you are, what's going to happen going forward. How are they ever going to be able to carry that debt? And there's no plan in place to ever get the debt down. Now, if you're carrying debt to finance assets, that's okay. I mean, if you take out a mortgage to build a factory, it's an income producing asset. It's okay to carry debt. We're incurring debt to pay expenses. And in business, that's the first sign a business is about to go under, when they're borrowing money to pay expenses, not using debt to finance growth.
It's kind of the definition of insolvency.
Yes, yes. And you know, today, the problems we're facing, look, inflation is running at 8.3% on an annualized basis. The May number comes out this Friday. Now, most economists think it won't be that bad. I disagree. I think the inflation number for the month of May is going to be at least 1% and possibly significantly higher. That will take the 12-month inflation number up to about 8.7%, which again is a 40-year high. Not since 1981 has it been this bad. So that'll take that inflation number up. And I think it's going to get worse in the summer. Why do I say that? Energy prices are continuing to rise. I think 27 of the last 28 days or something, we've hit record prices for gasoline. And the big problem is food inflation. Food prices are going to start to go up dramatically for a couple of reasons. One, the farmers tell me They're paying twice the amount that they used to pay for fertilizers. They can't get people to come to work. And as a result of that, they have to pay higher wages. Say, well, that's good for the worker. Yeah, it is. But it increases the labor cost for farmers. And worse off, all of their equipment uses diesel fuel. And while gasoline is at record high at close to $5 a gallon, diesel fuel is up to $6 a gallon. So all of those higher costs for farmers are going to translate into higher prices in the coming months, adding to the problem. About 25% of the world's wheat supply and about 10% of some other grains are grown in Russia and Ukraine. Russia is blocking the port. Ukraine can't ship anything. And if Russia's doing all this fighting, they're not growing so much either. So there's going to be a reduction in the supply. When it's a reduction in supply of anything, the price goes up. So we'll be paying much more for not only energy, but for food. And we already have seen that, but we'll be paying more in the coming months for food. I think the overall inflation rate could hit double digits before the end of the summer. Let me say one other point. Worse yet, if there's a food shortage, we'll have higher prices, we'll pay it, we'll suffer through it. What about the third world countries? They can't afford to pay higher prices. You could see some very serious inflation problems going forward, starvation problems going forward.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, as a lawyer, I'm not a big shot corporate lawyer. So my clients are generally upper, middle to rich, but there are also a lot of working people as clients. And I can tell you that the average American is dead broke. They are literally living off a credit card. Instead of cutting their expenses, we have lost character in this country and morality. And when you have character, like the Depression generation that my father came from, you learn what's important in life, you learn priorities. But these people will not deny themselves anything. And self-control and self-denial is just as important in economics as it is in life. Do you?
Yeah, you're right. That part of the reason why the gas prices are going up so much is people continue to pay it and continue to buy gasoline. It'll stop going up when people say, I'm not going to pay that anymore. I know I need gas because of the lifestyle I've set up, but if there's ways I can cut back, if I can carpool, if I can cut back on some of my discretionary driving, I should start doing that. They haven't done that yet. And as a result, the prices keep going up, people keep paying it, and that feeds the inflation. They're entitled to have this lifestyle that they have. Whether they can afford it or not, they're entitled to it. And they deserve to be able to drive wherever they want. They deserve to be able to buy the most expensive food. Well, things are going to change, particularly for the lower wage workers and people on fixed incomes. That's who inflation really clobbers. You know, the higher income people, prices go up a little bit, so you have a little less money to save and invest, but you end up paying it. Lower income people don't save or invest very much. Fixed income people don't save or invest anything. So what happens is when the cost of necessities go up, they try to cut back, but inflation is so bad, you've got to spend more money on that. That gives you less money to spend on other things. That's one of the reasons why the economy is likely to go into recession, if it's not already here now, is that people are going to be spending more on the necessities. They'll have less to spend on the other things. They'll see a decline in their standard of living, but that'll reduce overall demand. Even Target and Walmart are reporting profits are going down. People are buying the staples, but they're not buying all the other things. And as a result of that, they're going to start to slow down, and that will lead to a recession. Let me say one other point why I keep saying we may be in a recession now. The first quarter of this year, GDP declined at 1.5%. You have negative growth. Now, the second quarter, most economists are forecasting a 2 to 3% growth rate. However, they forecasted 2 to 3% last quarter too, and we got negative. If we get negative growth this quarter, and again, most economists don't think we will, but if we get negative growth, that's 2 successive quarters of negative growth in GDP, that's the classic definition of a recession. So we may be in a recession now. I don't think so, but it's possible we're in a recession now and we have high inflation. Well, when you get a stagnant economy with rising prices, inflation, we call that stagflation, stagnant economy with inflation. Stagflation, we haven't seen that since the late 70s into the early 80s. The problem is to resolve it is extremely painful. The Federal Reserve has to start jacking interest rates way up. Now they're going to do that anyway. Next week, they'll raise rates by 0.5%. In July, at least 0.5%, and 2 or 3 times more before the end of the year. But if this inflation rate gets higher, they'll get even more aggressive, as they did back in 1981, when interest rates were sky high, mortgages were 14%. It brought the inflation rate down, but it led to a very severe recession. So the action to end the stagflation is very painful. The sooner we get started on working on this, the better.
Well, it's interesting. You probably heard the illustrious Treasury Secretary last week, Janet Yellen, who was part and parcel of the '08 housing bust when she was at the San Francisco Fed. She's up there on the podium saying, "Oh, I didn't really understand inflation." Wait a minute. This woman has been in this field all her life. She was the head of the Federal Reserve. She's now the Treasury Secretary. She doesn't understand what inflation is. So the question comes to me, is she a moron, which I doubt? Is she lying, which is, since she's in government, is a good possibility, or is she evil? The 3 choices.
None of them look good.
Actually say that.
You know, as a matter of fact, yesterday, my Newsmax column, I wrote about Janet Yellen's been wrong about a number of things. So Janet Yellen is a very intelligent lady. She has, I think, an Ivy League PhD. She teaches at Cal Berkeley, and she's had plenty of experience in government, as you note. The thing is, what happened to her, I think, is she was more concerned with solving real or perceived social injustices and curing climate change using economic policy. And as a result of that, she didn't put the primary goals of economic policy, as said, are price stability, keep inflation low, full employment, keep unemployment low, and growth. That's what you should focus on. Instead, the Biden fiscal policy, Janet Yellen is part of, and even the Fed's monetary policy last year, they were more concerned with solving social problems. CEOs make more than everybody else. Students graduate with debt. Everybody doesn't have health care. Some people can't afford daycare. They wanted to solve all of those problems, and they were not concerned with what was happening with the economy. So I think she's finally waking up. You know, she tried to convince us that monetary theory didn't work anymore. You can increase the money supply and it wouldn't be inflationary. She called it modern monetary theory. Turned out that was wrong. Then she tried to say, well, we can increase government spending, and if we do it so we encourage business to make more stuff, that's the new modern supply side economics. So the government can spend more. Well, that's not right either. Government spends more, it adds to aggregate demand, increases excess demand, and leads to inflation. So I think, again, she's a very intelligent lady, but I think she lost sight of what the goals should be, economic goals, and tried to implement these social goals and climate change. And as a result, she wasn't concentrating on looking at some of the economic problems that could lead to the inflation we have today.
Well, I was at a meeting, an economics meeting at the Union League Club in New York City a while back. And at that time, Hubbard, the economics professor,
Hubbard, yeah,
was, I think, from Columbia, I believe.
Yep.
He was the speaker. And so I asked him a very simple question, because he was in the running to become Federal Reserve Chairman. I said, could you please tell me what article and section of the Constitution gives any authority for there to be a Federal Reserve? And he became Jackie Gleason. $60,000 question. Humana. You know, that's the reaction I usually get when I ask a question. So to sum up, here's the issue, and I want to see how you address it. For a while, we got away with all this creation of fake money because it went into, through the Cantillon effect, the assets of the rich. And it didn't go into consumer prices as much. It was going into real estate, it was going into the stock market. But then about 2 years ago, it began to go into the things that are necessities that everyone needs. And that, of course, caused a political reaction because even the uneducated Americans, which are most Americans, even if they go to college, they actually become more uneducated. They would go to the gas station and say, oh my God. So now the Fed has a choice. They can continue the crack up boom as described by Ludwig von Mises, or they can cause, if they want to lower demand, they can cause a depression to wash out all of the malinvestment. And as you said, it will be incredibly painful, especially in an immoral and spoiled population. But there really is no other way. You either have to continue it going until it collapses into hyperinflation and becomes a Weimar Republic, or you have to temporarily create pain. And we're only, as I see it, at the beginning innings of the baseball game. How do you see it?
I see it the same way. So the Fed didn't care about inflation because last year they said it was temporary. They used the word transitory and said it'll go away once the supply chain recovers. Well, the economy today is producing at a higher rate than before the pandemic. So in the aggregate sense, we don't have a supply chain problem. Now, in certain industries, computer chips and baby formula and a few other things, there's just some supply chain issues. And because we have a transportation problem, not enough truckers, there's some supply chain issues. And that's contributing somewhat to inflation. But that's not the major causes of inflation. The reason we have inflation is the Biden administration wants to get rid of fossil fuels. So they canceled the Keystone Pipeline. You can't drill on federal lands anymore. You can't drill off the coast of Alaska. The permitting process is harder. Banks shouldn't lend to the petroleum industry because there's no future. They restricted the supply of fossil fuels that at a time when the economy was recovering and demand was increasing, that led to higher energy prices. Secondly, the federal government paid people not to work. So they gave them stimulus money and they added money to their unemployment check. And you didn't have to pay your rent anymore because you couldn't get kicked out of your apartment because there was a 2-year moratorium on that. College students didn't have to pay their loans anymore because they put a moratorium on that. So people said, the government's giving me free money. I don't have to work. I'm not going back to work. So even though we're producing more today, there's about 1 million fewer workers. Well, to get workers to come back, you have to raise the wages, like I talked about with the farmer. Well, that's good for the worker, but again, it drives up labor costs. So on the cost side, you have higher energy costs to produce higher labor costs. On the demand side, where most of the inflation is being caused, the federal government has deficit spent nearly $6 trillion in the last 2 years. On a $22 trillion annual economy, that's pure inflation. And Biden wants to spend even more money. And the fourth reason, as you mentioned, the Federal Reserve was shockingly irresponsible in their monetary policy for the last year or so. Now, inflation is the main problem. They have to wring the inflation out. They keep saying we can do this and bring the economy in for a soft landing. They say, I don't think that's possible. They're going to have to raise interest rates significantly, as mentioned before, going forward. That'll take a lot of demand out of the economy, but it'll be done at a time when consumers are feeling inflation, and because they're spending more on those necessities and less for the other goods, that reduces demand for the other goods. And I think we're heading again for that recession at the end, and we may be in it already, and a severe stagflation problem, in which case, as you just said, the Federal Reserve is going to have to get even more aggressive to bring this under control, and it will be very painful. I agree with you completely.
So we have the Biden theme song, "Brother, can you spare a dime?" That'll be brought out again, the anthem of the Depression. And to be fair, which president from Biden to Trump to Obama, etc., which president vetoed a spending bill?
I'm thinking as hard as I can here.
None. None.
Couldn't come up with any.
I would have vetoed every single bill, and I wouldn't care if I had to shut down the whole government. It would actually be the greatest thing. The American people could be safe if the government was shut down. So, Dr. Busler, I commend you for bringing these points out. I think most Americans are too busy watching the boob tube and listening to CNBS and listening to what a great boom, it's booming. The economy is booming. It's unbelievable. Great news. And they sit there like dummies. You know, it's like in my old neighborhood. It was a very poor neighborhood. They used to have these old Chevys with like a dog in the back, and the dog would go like this, you know, nodding his head.
I'm familiar with that.
People, they have no idea. And as Gerald Celente says, when people lose everything, they lose it. So I think we're going to see violence. I think it's going to be very unsafe. And at the same time, they want to take away my firearms. Not a good combination. So all these subjects come together, isn't it funny? And all these seemingly disparate subjects kind of all meld together. So once again, thank you very much. Anybody who wants to read your columns can go to the fine publication at newsmax.com and Town Hall, and just they can Google your name, I'm sure. And they can also, I guess you have stuff online at Stockton University.
Yeah, let me say, I tweet out every one of my columns. That's at @mbusler, at MBUSLER. And if you have a Facebook page, search for Funding Democracy. Funding Democracy. I have a page will come up there. Every one of my columns I post there. And if anybody followed me, I'd be real happy.
I think we're mostly funding communism, not democracy.
I hope not.
All right. Well, you take care.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate this. Look forward to doing it again.
Likewise. Take care.